Hi, my name is Raphael, and I will present our paper, Spoki, Unveiling a New Wave of Scanners Through a Reactive Network Telescope. This is joint work with my colleagues Marcin, Alistair, Alberto, and Professor Schmidt and Wählisch. I want to start with the observation that the share of irregular TCP SYNs has been increasing over the last 6 to 7 years. What we see here is data collected in the USENIX network telescope, which is a /9 IPv4 prefix. What we actually see is the share of TCP SYNs that have a TTL over 200. We can see there are two shifts in this graph. Once around 2014, there's a first rise, and then later at the end of 2016, there's a much steeper rise until we see 75% of irregular SYNs in the telescope. But what exactly is a SYN irregularity? There are three characteristics here, and they don't have to appear all together. They can also come separately. The first one is the high TTL that already saw on the first graph. A TTL over 200 is irregular because common operating systems usually use much lower values. Next is packets that don't carry any TCP options. This is similarly unlikely because operating systems usually use options such as MSS, window size, timestamp, or SARC. And lastly, there are packets that have a fixed IP ID of 54321, which some of you might recognize. And altogether, we see a share of about 75% of irregular SYNs at the USENIX network telescope, which begs the question if this phenomenon is specific to this vantage point in the USENIX network telescope, or if we can see this elsewhere. We think this is a global phenomenon. First, I want to look at the USENIX data again. We here see a graph that shows the two lines, one for packets with a high TTL and one for those that don't have TCP options. In the USENIX network telescope in the months of April, May, and June in 2020. And here you can see that both lines are at around 75%, and they largely overlap. Our next two vantage points are different. They actually carry flow data. So this is actually production data and different from a network telescope. The first one is an IXP in Europe. And while the lines are much more erratic here, we can still see that they often cross 75% and sometimes go even higher. And for our last vantage point, we have an ISP from Asia. And here again, we see relatively stable lines around 75%. So we think this is a global phenomenon. This isn't specific to network telescopes. Which begs the question, do these packets pose a threat? For that, I want to introduce some background on stateless scanning. Stateless scanning allows you to scan the internet in less than 1 hour on commodity hardware. The idea is to increase scan speeds by avoiding local state. Instead, handcrafted probes are sent via raw sockets, and replies can be recognized via SYN cookies. This was first popularized by ZMap around 2013, and then later abused by Mirai in 2016. If we come back to our original graph, we can see that the rises here coincide with this data. Around 2013, ZMap kind of created the first rise, and then later Mirai correlates with the second rise in this in irregular TCP SYNs. So how can stateless scanning be abused? For that, I want to talk about two-phase scanning. The idea of two-phase scanning is that scanners scan in multiple phases. In the first phase, they come on the transport layer. They send these handcrafted irregular stateless SYNs to identify responsive hosts. And then in the second phase, they connect again to these responsive hosts on the application layer. For this, they use the OS level TCP handshake, and then they can deliver payloads, do more reconnaissance, and collect additional information. We built a reactive network telescope called Spoki to reveal these two-phase scanners. Spoki interacts with two-phase scanners in real time. It's a scalable system based on actors and built with the C++ actor framework CAF. It uses libtrace for packet ingestion and Scamper for probing. The probes we send out here are TCP SYNs to accept connections and TCP resets to clean them up. Spoki also collects TCP payloads after establishing connections. It is deployed in 2/24 prefixes, one in the US and one in the EU, and the code is open source on GitHub. To highlight the scalability a bit, we probed Spoki with about 1 million probes per second. And what you see here on the x-axis is the packet volume we sent at Spoki, and on the y-axis you can see how many parallel components we needed. And the core components, ingestion, the core logic, and logging all require relatively few components to handle this packet load. For probing, we needed about 50 Scamper instances. However, Scamper has not been optimized for this scenario, so we think this number can be brought down. And given enough resources, Spoki can also scale to higher packet volumes. Let's talk about the analysis. The analysis here is based on those 2/24 prefixes and the data we collected there. First, I want to talk about the share of two-phase scanners. We see two lines here, one for all scanners or all sources that we saw that engaged in TCP scanning, and below in orange, the second line for those that engaged in two-phase scanning. You can see that across our measurement period, the share is about 30%, even with like dips in between. Next, I want to highlight the most targeted ports by two-phase scanners. These are the top 20 ports. One bar for the EU and one bar for the US. Everywhere you can see that the most scanned port is port 23, which is the port that was scanned by Mirai. The companion port 2323 can be seen on the left. There are two ports that stand out here, port 1433 and 7547, because these are nearly exclusively seen in the EU. The first port is used for the TDS protocol by Microsoft SQL and likely relates to a bug in the Symantec application of the German Siemens AG. The second one is used by TR069, which concerns home routers. Next, I want to talk about TCP payloads a bit. TCP payloads are kind of a feature of Spoki because in traditional telescopes, TCP payloads are not available. We also scanned the payloads that we collect for downloaders. This would be shellcode, such as wget or curl, to download further malware. Across our whole data set, we saw that about 60% in the EU and 80% in the US were ASCII decodable, so plain text payloads. About 40% and 13% were binary payloads that we saved as hex, encoded strings. And lastly, we can see that about 1% in the EU and 6% in the US contain these downloaders. The sample names and types of the malware we downloaded here matches known malware, such as the Mosi peer-to-peer botnet. We also compared these samples to VirusTotal. We found that Spoki detected 50% of the samples earlier than VirusTotal. 26% were benign, so even after a longer period of time, they still did not show up in VirusTotal. And the remainder, 59%, we considered as old because they were already known when Spoki first encountered them. While malware distribution clearly points at malicious intent, we wondered if we could validate our findings and kind of extend them to the larger data set. As a first approach, we did a semi-manual analysis. Here we classified the payloads based on common characteristics and kind of looked through them manually. We found more attacks. We already saw port 1433 and 7547 in the most commonly scanned ports, but there are others, such as an attack on ADB via port 555 that installs crypto miners. There are attacks on embedded devices that kind of hijack them and gain control. There's a Realtek UPnP exploit and more. So as a second approach, we went to a threat intelligence provider, Grey Noise, and kind of collected information about the source addresses. Grey Noise classifies IPs into the categories malicious, benign, and unknown. And if we look at our whole data set, we can see that about 30 to 40% of the sources that send us two-phase events, that send us any events, are malicious. However, if we only look at the two-phase events, we can see that about 60 to 70% of these events come from malicious sources. So there's a concentration here on two-phase scanning amongst malicious sources. For the last two slides, I want to talk about locality. The first one is geographical scanning locality. Scanners focus on different ports in Europe and the US. Different vendors and different deployments likely attract different attacks based on the vulnerabilities they have. We already saw that the TDS payload on port 1433 is scanned in the EU much more. Similarly, SMB negotiation messages, both highlighted in blue, are also seen in the EU nearly exclusively. There are others that are seen more in the US, such as TLS client hello messages or the ADB attack that we saw. But even for the lower volume payloads, we can see that they still have a slight tendency to focus on one region. In these cases, for example, the US. But geographical scanning locality is not the only locality we observe. We also saw topological scanning locality. 6 of the top 10 source prefixes in the EU, these would be the sources of the scanners, share a /16 prefix with our /24 vantage point. So they probably have a more specific prefix inside of this /16 prefix. The scanning behavior is associated with botnets. And we could not observe a similar locality in the US or in our US data set. However, we cross-checked this observation with the European IXP traffic, and here we found that local irregular SYNs can be seen in 370 prefixes with about 150 packets per host. And these packets are very focused. 69% of them focused on only 3 ports, which are 23, 7547, and 8291. And we checked these sources and could see that these sources are actually MikroTik routers that were hijacked in multiple cases, so likely botnets. We also checked this at the Asian ISP, and here we couldn't see any correlation either. So for our takeaways, we built Spoki, a reactive network telescope that makes two-phase scanners visible and collects their payloads. We found that irregular SYNs dominate SYNs on the internet with a share of roughly 75%. We also found that two-phase scanners act as a catalyst. So make sure that you use short update cycles in your systems to keep up with their fast pace. Two-phase scanners are used for malicious activity. They deliver a variety of malware, and botnets use them to attack systems. Two-phase scanners follow locality patterns, so if you use your data set to learn something about your deployment, you should make sure that your data set fits your deployment in the right locality. But lastly, two-phase scanners have detectable signatures. This is good for us because they can be tracked and their packets can be filtered. Thank you.